A six-car collision burned across the middle of a Kansas highway as something that used to be human slammed a police cruiser hard enough to flip it end over end. And by the time the second officer crawled out through shattered glass, the thing was already dragging a screaming civilian toward the tree line while its eyes burned black and its jaw unhinged wider than bone should allow. The EMF meter in Dean Winchester's hand began screaming before the Impala had even come to a full stop, and the sulfur stink hit the air just as three more bodies jerked upright from the asphalt like puppets being yanked by invisible wires. Gunfire didn't slow them down, devil's traps didn't hold, and when one of them leapt high enough to crash onto the hood of the car, something else landed nearby with a sound like dropped luggage. He didn't look impressed, didn't ask questions, and didn't even seem to notice that the possessed man's claws snapped against his bald head without drawing blood, because as far as Saitama was concerned, this was just another weird Tuesday interrupting his walk. What happened next would force heaven and hell to notice something they had no record of, and they were already preparing to respond. If you're watching this now, understand that once this begins there's no clean ending waiting on the other side. And the next time something unexplained appears, it may already be too late to classify it. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when heaven decides containment is the only option left. By the time Dean forced the Impala sideways across both lanes to block what was left of the accident scene, the paramedics had already stopped trying to pull survivors out of the wreckage because the survivors kept standing back up on their own. One of them staggered forward with a shattered femur poking visibly through torn fabric and skin, and still managed to sprint at a highway patrolman fast enough to send both of them tumbling into the ditch as the man's eyes turned completely black. Sam was already halfway out of the passenger door with rock salt loaded, shouting for civilians to get back, while the EMF in Dean's hand screamed hard enough to vibrate. Somewhere behind them, something else had landed with enough weight to leave a crater in the dirt shoulder, and neither of them had noticed yet. The first possessed civilian reached the Impala before Dean could chamber the next round, slamming into the hood hard enough to dent steel, and the second came from the side with its jaw stretching open, far beyond anything human anatomy allowed as it lunged for Sam's throat. The shot hit center mass and barely slowed it down, forcing Sam to shove it backward against the wrecked remains of a guardrail while yelling for Dean to get the trap ready. But before either of them could drag chalk across asphalt, the possessed man suddenly stopped mid-motion as his face flattened like clay against something that hadn't been there a second earlier. Saitama hadn't intended to get involved at all, mostly because he'd been looking for a grocery store he'd seen on the map earlier, and this detour didn't seem worth the effort. But when something with black eyes tried to bite him while he walked past the overturned ambulance, his response had been automatic. The possessed civilian was now embedded several inches into the side of the wrecked cruiser, unmoving, while Saitama looked down at his hand with mild annoyance as if he'd accidentally stepped in something unpleasant. The other two demons hesitated, not out of fear but confusion, because they had watched a human being absorb a direct claw strike to the face without even blinking. Dean saw it happen and immediately shifted targets, because nothing in their experience suggested that a normal civilian should be able to swat a possessed host hard enough to produce a crater in reinforced steel. The shotgun came up smoothly and leveled at Saitama's chest, while Sam shouted that they didn't know what this guy was yet, and Castiel's name was already halfway out of his mouth. Saitama glanced at the weapon, then back at the demon now trying unsuccessfully to pry its own arm free from the asphalt where it had punched down to catch its balance, and asked if this was some kind of street performance. That was the exact moment when one of the remaining possessed civilians attempted to leap directly at him from behind, only to have its entire upper body removed by a casual backhand that carried enough force to send the rest of it sliding across 3 lanes of highway like discarded luggage. The impact didn't just kill the host, it ruptured the demonic presence inside in a way neither Winchester had ever witnessed before, as a burning distortion of sulfur and shadow tore free from the corpse and evaporated outright instead of escaping. Sam stopped mid-sentence because demons weren't supposed to die like that, and Dean's finger tightened on the trigger because nothing about this made sense within any known hunting framework. Saitama didn't seem to notice that anything unusual had happened beyond the mess, asking instead whether someone could tell him where the nearest supermarket was since this road didn't appear to have any signage. The final possessed civilian lunged anyway, claws outstretched, only to crumple instantly when Saitama flicked it in the forehead with enough force to snap the host's neck and scatter another burst of demonic residue into the air like mist. This time the demon tried to retreat instead of burning out, but it didn't make it more than a few feet before collapsing into nothingness, as though something fundamental had been disrupted. Sam lowered his weapon slowly because demons didn't get destroyed by physical trauma. Not like that, not ever, and whatever this man was had just done it twice without any ritual, sigil, or exorcism. Dean didn't lower his, because for all they knew this was something worse wearing a human face, something that hadn't made it into any lore book yet. When Castiel appeared beside the Impala with the familiar sound of displaced air, his gaze locked onto Saitama immediately and didn't move. "I don't understand what I'm seeing," Castiel said, not to them but to himself, because there was no soul present in the way heaven recognized one, and yet this being was undeniably alive. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing slightly, as if expecting the disguise to drop or the vessel to split open and reveal whatever had crawled inside. Saitama asked if this was another performer and whether the coat was part of the act, while the angel reached out cautiously as though touching something radioactive. Every ward carved into the Impala's frame remained inert, every holy symbol unreactive, every protection they carried completely indifferent to Saitama's presence, and yet the ambient electromagnetic readings were still spiking wildly in a way Sam couldn't explain. Castiel's hand stopped an inch from Saitama's shoulder as realization began to settle in, not of threat, but of absence, like trying to find a reflection that simply wasn't there. He said quietly that heaven had no record of anything like this. And somewhere very far away, something in hell took notice as the first demonic signature simply ceased to exist without passing through any known exit. The demonic presence that should have fled the moment its host body was destroyed didn't return to the nearest crossroads, didn't snap back into the pit, and didn't even leave behind the usual sulfuric distortion that marked a forced ejection, because from hell's perspective it had simply stopped existing altogether. That kind of disappearance didn't register as death in any conventional sense, which meant something had bypassed the natural exit points entirely. And the moment the second signature vanished in exactly the same way, a chain reaction of attention began to move upward through the ranks. Demons didn't get erased by blunt force trauma, not by angels, not by hunters, and certainly not by an unidentified civilian standing in the middle of a traffic accident asking about discount produce. Back on the highway, Dean had repositioned himself between Saitama and the nearest surviving civilian, shotgun still trained squarely at his chest, while Sam tried to reconcile what he'd just witnessed with every piece of lore he'd ever memorized. Castiel hadn't moved from where he stood, but his posture had shifted from passive observation to something closer to alert containment, as if the next step required a decision he didn't want to make without confirmation. Saitama seemed unaware of the tension building around him, glancing down at the crater his foot had left in the asphalt, and remarking that the road quality in this area was surprisingly poor. Sam attempted the rational approach first, asking whether Saitama had any idea what those people had been doing or why their eyes had turned black, and received a shrug in response that carried no trace of concern. Dean interpreted that as either ignorance or evasion and asked where he'd learned to do whatever that had just been, because humans didn't flick demons out of existence with their fingertips. Saitama replied that he usually just exercised regularly and avoided air conditioning when possible, which did nothing to clarify the situation, and only deepened Dean's suspicion that this was some kind of entity playing dumb. Castiel finally spoke again, stating plainly that he could not perceive a soul inside Saitama's body, nor could he detect any demonic or angelic presence, which in his experience left only two remaining categories and neither of them fit. Hunters relied on classification to determine response, but there was no classification here, and the longer the angel looked, the more the absence seemed deliberate rather than concealed. Saitama asked if that meant he didn't have to pay for damages to the police car, which Dean chose not to answer because the vehicle in question had been compressed into something resembling abstract art. The decision to attempt containment came from instinct rather than strategy, because if this was an unknown entity capable of annihilating demons physically, then letting him walk away into civilian areas without understanding what he was would be negligent at best. Sam moved to finish the devil's trap they'd started earlier, chalk dragging across broken pavement in a wide arc while Dean kept the weapon steady. Castiel remained in place as the final line closed, waiting to see if anything would react. Saitama stepped directly across the completed sigil without slowing down, not out of defiance, but because he hadn't noticed it was there, and the chalk lines didn't flare or activate because there was nothing for them to register. The trap had been calibrated to hold demonic or angelic energy, and Saitama carried neither, which meant the moment he walked into its center, nothing happened at all beyond a faint crunch of chalk beneath his shoe. Sam stared at the unbroken circle as if expecting it to correct itself, while Dean swore under his breath because even ghosts reacted to that configuration. Castiel adjusted his stance and extended a hand, attempting to impose angelic restraint in the way he might hold a demon vessel in place long enough for an exorcism to begin. The air around Saitama didn't ripple, didn't resist, and didn't even acknowledge the attempt, as though the command had been issued into empty space. For a fraction of a second, the angel looked confused, and in that fraction, Saitama stepped forward to peer at the shotgun barrel from a closer angle, asking whether it was supposed to look bent like that. Dean hadn't noticed the bend until that moment, but the reinforced steel of the barrel had indeed warped slightly inward where Saitama's knuckles had brushed it earlier while passing by, and that realization forced a recalculation he didn't like. Sam said they needed to call Bobby, because this was outside anything they could handle alone, and Castiel agreed that Heaven would require a report immediately. Saitama asked if Bobby knew where the grocery store was. Far below them, in a chamber that had never needed to consider the possibility of physical erasure, the first response units from Hell began preparing an interception rather than a possession. The absence of a returning demonic signature did more than raise alarms in Hell, because every disappearance without a trace forced a recalibration of the tracking systems that monitored possession events across North America. Normally, a demon ejected from its host would snap back into the nearest accessible plane or retreat along established spiritual pathways, leaving behind a residue that could be cataloged and followed. This time there was no pathway, no recoil, and no residual burn, which meant whatever had happened on that Kansas highway had severed something fundamental enough to bypass the rules governing demonic transit entirely. Sam spent most of the drive to Bobby's salvage yard watching Saitama through the rearview mirror, not because he expected aggression, but because nothing about the man aligned with any known supernatural profile. The EMF readings had stabilized the moment they left the crash site, yet there was still no detectable soul in the passenger seat, and Castiel's silence suggested that Heaven's internal registries were returning the same empty results. Dean had insisted on restraints initially, but the handcuffs had snapped the first time Saitama shifted to get comfortable, and the replacement set hadn't fared any better when he absent-mindedly scratched his wrist. Saitama didn't seem to notice the tension, asking instead why the radio kept playing the same 3 songs, and whether there was any reason they couldn't stop for food along the way. Dean interpreted that as either deliberate misdirection or genuine disinterest, neither of which improved his assessment of the situation. Castiel remained in the back seat, eyes fixed on Saitama as though expecting some delayed manifestation of grace or corruption that might finally explain what they were dealing with. By the time they reached the salvage yard, Bobby Singer had already begun chalking protective sigils along the perimeter, because Sam's phone call had included enough detail to warrant caution without explanation. Hunters depended on preparation, and whatever this was, it had destroyed 2 demons without ritual or invocation. Bobby's first look at Saitama lasted exactly 3 seconds before he asked whether this was a joke, and his second lasted long enough to confirm that none of the wards reacted when the man stepped across them. Every protective measure Bobby had spent decades refining remained inert, from iron filings embedded in the threshold to the layered devil's traps beneath the floorboards, all of which should have triggered on anything even partially aligned with demonic or angelic energy. Saitama removed his shoes at the door out of habit, commenting that the place smelled like oil and dust, while Bobby checked the EMF meter twice to confirm it wasn't malfunctioning. Sam began explaining what had happened on the highway, including the way the demons had disintegrated instead of escaping. Bobby's expression shifted from skepticism to concern as the implications settled in, because destroying a demon outright without divine intervention wasn't something hunters had ever documented. Castiel added that he could not perceive a soul within Saitama's body, which eliminated the possibility of possession, but introduced an entirely different category of problem. Saitama asked whether there was anything to eat that didn't involve canned beans. The first attempt at systemic analysis came from Sam, who began cross-referencing historical accounts of entities lacking souls, while Bobby booted up a laptop that had survived more exorcisms than most hunters. Every database they accessed returned partial matches at best, referencing constructs, empty vessels, or artificially created beings that still carried some form of metaphysical imprint. Saitama carried none, which meant there was nothing to anchor him within the framework's heaven, and hell relied on to monitor existence. News reports had already begun circulating online about the highway incident, initially framed as a gas leak causing mass hysteria before amateur footage surfaced showing bodies moving in ways that defied injury. The moment Saitama appeared in one of those clips, swatting a man hard enough to crater a police cruiser, the narrative shifted from accident to anomaly. Government monitoring systems flagged the footage for analysis, because civilians weren't supposed to punch through reinforced steel. By the time Bobby found a stable connection, multiple agencies had begun requesting access to traffic camera archives from the surrounding counties, and the Department of Homeland Security had issued a preliminary notice regarding potential biohazard events. None of them understood what they were looking at yet, but the pattern recognition software identified Saitama as the only consistent variable across both demonic terminations. Sam pointed out that this was becoming a public problem. Castiel received confirmation from Heaven moments later that no such being existed in their records, which meant classification would require direct observation under controlled conditions. Bobby interpreted that as angel speak for containment and began checking the integrity of the warding system again. Saitama asked if anyone else found it strange that the television remote had so many buttons. And somewhere in the upper atmosphere, an angelic reconnaissance unit was already being dispatched to evaluate whether this anomaly represented a threat to divine order. The first network to air the footage didn't realize what they had until the slowed replay showed a civilian in a plain yellow suit standing in the middle of a demonic outbreak, and ending it with what looked like casual swatting motions. Initially, it ran as a human interest segment buried beneath speculation about chemical exposure. But within hours, the clip had been extracted, enhanced, reposted, and dissected across platforms that didn't wait for official confirmation. By the time the second video surfaced from a different angle, clearly showing a possessed host collapsing after a single flick to the forehead, The conversation had shifted from accident to unidentified biological anomaly operating within U.S. borders. At Bobby's salvage yard, the television remained muted while Sam tracked the upload timestamps and Dean watched Saitama examine a dented coffee mug, as though its structural integrity posed a personal challenge. Castile stood near the window, gaze angled skyward in a way that suggested incoming traffic, and Bobby had already begun disconnecting the landline because hunters didn't benefit from federal attention. Saitama asked if the internet always argued this much about road maintenance. Government response followed the footage within a predictable window, beginning with requests for eyewitness interviews before escalating to jurisdictional disputes over who had authority to classify what had happened. The Department of Defense requested access to the crash site debris, while the CDC issued a provisional statement about possible neurological agents influencing group behavior. None of the explanations accounted for the part where an unarmed man had embedded a possessed civilian into a police cruiser without apparent effort. Dean pointed out that once the feds started pulling traffic cams from nearby towns, it wouldn't take long to trace the Impala's route away from the scene, which meant they were operating on borrowed time. Sam agreed, because Saitama's presence had already been flagged as a variable in 2 separate disappearance events, now under review by agencies that didn't believe in demons. Bobby began packing weapons not because he expected to fight Saitama, but because containment attempts rarely distinguished between hunter and target. Saitama seemed unconcerned with any of this, asking whether there was a grocery store within walking distance, since the canned beans situation appeared to be permanent. Castile informed him that leaving the property might complicate matters, which Saitama interpreted as a suggestion rather than a restriction. The front door opened without resistance when he tried it, despite the layered wards carved into its frame. Outside, the reconnaissance unit arrived without fanfare, manifesting as 3 figures in dark suits who crossed the property line without triggering any of Bobby's protections, because they weren't aligned with demonic energy. Their attention fixed immediately on Saitama, whose lack of metaphysical signature registered as an absence loud enough to demand verification. One of them stepped forward, raising a hand in what might have been greeting or restraint. Saitama nodded politely and asked if they knew where he could buy discounted produce, which was the moment when the lead angel attempted to impose containment by force. The command moved through the air with enough authority to paralyze most vessels instantly, but Saitama continued walking as though someone had spoken in another language entirely. The second attempt carried more intent and produced the same result. Castile moved between them before escalation could continue, stating that heaven required further analysis before any decision could be made regarding classification. The lead angel interpreted that as hesitation and adjusted its stance accordingly, while Dean raised his weapon because nothing about this interaction suggested diplomacy would last. Sam watched the EMF meter spike again without any corresponding activation from the wards. Saitama reached the edge of the driveway and looked back to ask whether anyone wanted anything from the store, unaware that his continued movement had already been captured by a news helicopter circling beyond visual range. The live feed cut across multiple networks within minutes, reframing the incident as a developing security concern involving unidentified entities in rural Kansas. Civilian panic followed in the form of traffic congestion and emergency calls. And as the first containment order moved from recommendation to directive, military liaison teams were already being mobilized toward the nearest confirmed sighting. The decision to move from observation to engagement wasn't made by any single agency, because by the time the news helicopter's live feed confirmed visual contact with both the Winchester's vehicle and an unidentified bald civilian who had just ignored 3 separate angelic restraint attempts, jurisdiction had already fractured across half a dozen departments. Homeland Security classified the situation as a potential domestic biothreat based on behavioral anomalies, while the Department of Defense flagged the footage for immediate tactical review due to the visible deformation of reinforced materials during physical contact. Neither classification accounted for the part where religious iconography failed to register any reaction when Saitama crossed Bobby's warded threshold. Dean saw the first convoy crest the dirt road leading toward the salvage yard, and didn't need Sam to confirm that the plates weren't civilian, because hunters learned to recognize federal posture long before the suits arrived. Bobby had already begun dismantling portable ward arrays that might complicate movement, not because he expected them to hold against a military unit, but because anything that slowed their own exit would become a liability. Castiel remained near the gate, gaze fixed on the approaching vehicles in a way that suggested heaven had not authorized cooperation. Saitama noticed the convoy only when the dust plume reached the driveway, asking whether this was a local parade or some kind of outdoor festival he hadn't heard about. The first vehicle stopped short of the perimeter, followed by two more that fanned out into positions suggesting containment rather than negotiation, while a loudspeaker began issuing instructions for all occupants to exit the property with hands visible. Dean's response involved chambering another round and asking Sam how quickly they could be airborne if this went sideways. The answer arrived in the form of a drone descending into view above the tree line, its sensor array pivoting to track Saitama's position with mechanical precision that ignored everyone else present. Government analysis had identified him as the common denominator across two confirmed fatality clusters, and protocol dictated isolation before escalation. Saitama waved at the drone out of politeness, then asked whether it could point him toward the nearest supermarket. Castiel stepped forward as the second vehicle deployed personnel equipped with non-lethal suppression gear calibrated for enhanced targets, because Heaven's directive had shifted from observation to interference the moment federal involvement became unavoidable. Angels did not share containment responsibilities with human authorities, and the presence of military hardware complicated classification. The lead operative raised a device designed to emit focused electromagnetic pulses intended to disrupt anomalous nervous systems. The pulse discharged with a sharp crack that rattled loose tools on Bobby's workbench and caused the Impala's headlights to flicker, yet Saitama continued standing in place with the same mildly curious expression he'd worn since arriving. The drone's telemetry spiked as its onboard diagnostics failed to reconcile the absence of physiological response, prompting a second discharge at higher intensity. This time, the surrounding grass flattened under the pressure wave, while Saitama scratched his cheek and asked whether something was buzzing. Dean's tactical assessment shifted immediately, because non-response to that level of output suggested either extreme resilience or complete incompatibility with the device's target parameters. Sam began calculating how quickly the footage would circulate once someone inside the convoy realized what had just happened. Bobby swore under his breath because escalation rarely stopped at non-lethal measures. The third vehicle's rear compartment opened to reveal a heavier suppression platform that required two operators to position, its barrel aligning with Saitama's torso in preparation for deployment. Castiel's warning came a fraction too late to matter, because the discharge had already left the chamber by the time he spoke, carrying enough force to crater concrete at close range. The impact lifted dust and debris into the air around Saitama without moving him an inch. When the cloud settled, he was still standing there, looking down at the shallow depression in the dirt with mild interest, as though someone had dropped a particularly heavy object nearby. He tapped the edge of the crater with his foot to test its depth, then asked again whether anyone knew where the grocery store was. Behind the convoy, additional rotor noise began to build as air support moved into position, and the engagement protocol updated from containment to full operational response. The helicopters arrived low enough to flatten the salvage yard's perimeter fencing beneath rotor wash, their approach vectors coordinated in a way that suggested someone had already decided this situation required air superiority before dialogue. What had begun as a biohazard classification was now trending toward hostile anomaly containment, because the second suppression discharge had produced zero measurable effect on the target, and protocol didn't account for variables that ignored directed force entirely. Saitama watched the aircraft descend with casual interest, as though this were an unusually elaborate delivery service. Dean didn't bother pretending this was still about public safety, because the moment air support locked into a holding pattern above private property, the objective had shifted from investigation to acquisition. Sam pointed out that whatever footage the convoy had captured would already be routing through secure channels, and once analysts confirmed Saitama's immunity to electromagnetic disruption, the next step would involve munitions calibrated for structural collapse. Bobby began calculating how quickly they could evacuate without drawing attention to the Impala's departure route. Castiel's attention had moved upward, tracking something beyond the helicopters that the others couldn't see, because Heaven had dispatched a second reconnaissance element that wasn't interested in sharing airspace with human machinery. Angels didn't require altitude to observe, but the presence of military assets complicated their approach vectors, and the directive had shifted again toward potential interference if containment crossed into lethal territory. Saitama asked whether the noise would continue for long, since it made conversation difficult. The first missile didn't come from the helicopters, because federal engagement rules still required confirmation before lethal force, but the drone's onboard systems had escalated autonomously after repeated non-response to suppression attempts. Its payload released with a sharp mechanical whine that barely registered over the rotor wash, streaking downward in a controlled arc that terminated exactly where Saitama had been standing a moment earlier. The impact consumed a section of Bobby's driveway in a burst of dirt and shattered concrete. He reappeared at the edge of the crater, having stepped aside out of mild inconvenience rather than urgency, and looked down at the damage with an expression that suggested disappointment in construction standards. The shockwave rattled every window in the salvage yard, while Dean shoved Sam backward to keep him clear of flying debris. Bobby's wards flickered without activating, because they weren't designed to recognize ordnance. The helicopter crews adjusted formation immediately, because the target had not only survived but vacated the impact zone without measurable delay, and thermal imaging now showed him standing in open view. A second missile followed, this one from a different vector, forcing Castiel to intervene by diverting its trajectory just enough to prevent collateral damage to the yard's main structure. Heaven's directive didn't extend to protecting human property, but classification took precedence over debris fields. Saitama glanced up at the altered flight path and asked whether someone was throwing things, then stepped forward through the drifting dust toward the convoy as if approaching a customer service desk. The suppression platform's operators hesitated, recalibrating for a target that had just walked out of a missile impact without visible injury. Sam realized that whatever this had been about initially, it was now a live demonstration being recorded from multiple angles. Civilian traffic had already begun diverting away from the county roads leading toward the yard, guided by emergency broadcasts that referenced an active security incident involving unidentified hostile entities. Social media carried the helicopter footage within minutes, reframing the anomaly as something capable of withstanding military-grade force. Economic markets responded with automated dips in sectors sensitive to domestic instability. As the third missile armed itself midair, an angelic presence intensified above the cloud layer. The engagement zone expanded to include the entire surrounding township. By the time the third missile descended into the newly designated engagement zone, the order had already moved beyond federal jurisdiction into something that neither Sam nor Dean had ever seen documented outside apocalyptic contingency plans. Emergency broadcasts were no longer advising detours, but instructing residents across 3 neighboring townships to shelter in place, while live aerial feeds cut intermittently, as network infrastructure attempted to manage simultaneous civilian uploads. What had begun as a rural containment effort now carried the logistical footprint of a declared airspace denial, and the presence of military hardware had drawn something else into the atmosphere that no government could authorize. Castile felt the second wave of angelic arrivals before they manifested, because heaven's internal deliberation had reached a conclusion that classified Saitama not as an immediate threat, but as a destabilizing variable requiring direct mandate. Angels didn't intervene in human tactical operations unless divine order risked contamination, and the fact that military ordnance had already failed to produce measurable response suggested a deviation from known creation parameters. When the first of them appeared above the helicopter formation, their wings displaced cloud cover in a way that forced multiple pilots to recalibrate flight paths without understanding why. Dean noticed the shift in air pressure before he saw anything, because hunters learned to recognize the moment when supernatural involvement escalated beyond manageable levels. Sam followed his gaze upward and realized that the light distortion wasn't atmospheric, while Bobby swore because federal engagement protocols didn't account for celestial interference. Saitama shaded his eyes against the glare and asked whether the helicopters were part of the same group as the people in suits earlier. The lead angel didn't announce itself so much as impose presence, stepping forward from a space that hadn't existed a second earlier, and fixing its attention on Saitama with the kind of scrutiny reserved for newly discovered phenomena. Containment wasn't the objective anymore, classification was, and heaven's records required confirmation before escalation to removal. Castile spoke first, stating that prior restraint attempts had proven ineffective, which the newcomer interpreted as justification for a higher-order mandate. Saitama listened to none of this, because his attention had shifted toward the convoy's rear vehicle, where someone appeared to be unpacking a larger piece of equipment that might have been relevant to groceries if viewed from the right angle. The angel extended a hand regardless, issuing a command that would have immobilized most vessels instantly, and received the same lack of response that had accompanied every prior attempt. From heaven's perspective, this wasn't resistance, it was absence. Military liaison officers monitoring the feed registered the moment when the angelic presence began interfering with drone telemetry, forcing a temporary shutdown of automated targeting systems that relied on stable electromagnetic fields. That shutdown bought Saitama enough time to walk across the driveway toward the suppression platform, examining its barrel with mild curiosity before tapping it to test structural integrity. The reinforced housing dented inward without audible strain. Sam watched the deformation occur in real time and realized that public perception had already shifted from anomaly to invulnerability, because live comment feeds were beginning to frame the engagement as proof of systemic vulnerability. Dean's tactical focus moved from Saitama to the expanding perimeter, because evacuation routes were collapsing under civilian panic triggered by inconsistent emergency messaging. Bobby noted that fuel prices had already spiked regionally due to automated supply chain responses. Above them, Heaven's mandate updated again, as the classification process failed to reconcile Saitama's continued non-registration with any known category of creation. Angels were now debating whether containment should transition into isolation at the metaphysical level, a process that would normally require cooperation from forces outside human jurisdiction. Castile hesitated before relaying that information aloud. And as the first containment lattice began forming in the upper atmosphere, Hell's interception units finally breached the perimeter from below. Hell didn't interpret Heaven's containment lattice as a protective measure, because from its perspective anything that required metaphysical isolation protocols was either a weapon or a resource, and both demanded immediate counterclaim. The breach didn't open in the sky, but beneath the engagement zone itself, manifesting as fractures in the ground that spread outward from the missile impact sites where reality had already been stressed by repeated force. Sulfur didn't seep so much as erupt, carried upward through cracks that widened into something resembling ventilation shafts for a pressure system that had never needed to account for erasure events. The first demonic interception unit surfaced without host bodies, because possession required time they no longer had, and the objective had shifted from infiltration to acquisition. Hunters had documented mass manifestations before, but this lacked the usual theatrics, emerging instead as distortions in the air that condensed into silhouettes shaped by intent rather than anatomy. Saitama noticed them only when one of the silhouettes passed between him and the suppression platform he'd been examining. Dean recognized the tactical shift immediately, because demons operating without vessels meant they were willing to risk exposure for proximity, which suggested a priority target worth that risk. Sam began reciting an exorcism out of reflex, even though nothing about this formation aligned with possession protocols, while Bobby reached for iron that wouldn't matter against something not yet bound to matter at all. Castile turned from the sky to the ground as heaven's lattice met resistance from below. The first attempt at contact came as a possession strike aimed directly at Saitama's nervous system, bypassing host mechanics entirely in favor of raw incursion. It passed through him without friction, as though encountering an absence where pathways should have been, and dispersed into static that carried no trace of return. The second tried a corruption vector calibrated for angelic vessels and achieved the same result. Saitama looked down at his chest where the distortion had entered and asked whether this was some kind of insect, brushing at the air with mild annoyance before stepping forward again. That movement carried him across a widening fracture in the driveway that had begun venting heat from somewhere far below, prompting Sam to shout a warning that arrived too late to matter. The ground held anyway. Military liaison teams monitoring from a safe distance registered simultaneous interference across both drone telemetry and communications arrays, because angelic containment fields and demonic breach signatures didn't share bandwidth well with human hardware. Civilian broadcasts cut out across 3 counties as infrastructure failed to prioritize between metaphysical events and emergency services. Market indicators dropped further as automated trading systems interpreted the blackout as a regional disaster. Heaven's containment lattice attempted to stabilize the breach by imposing spatial limits that normally restricted cross-planar movement, only to find that the fractures were expanding along vectors not recognized by divine mapping. Castile relayed that information with visible hesitation, because it implied that whatever Saitama represented was altering the engagement zone's metaphysical geometry simply by occupying it. Dean didn't like the way that sounded. Hell's interception units shifted tactics again, abandoning incursion in favor of physical manifestation drawn from ambient matter, forcing silhouettes into temporary cohesion that allowed for contact. One of them lunged, claws forming mid-motion, and struck Saitama's shoulder with enough force to crack concrete behind him. He turned, more surprised than threatened, and swatted the shape aside. The resulting impact didn't just disperse the manifestation, it collapsed the fracture beneath it, sealing a section of breach with a shockwave that traveled outward into both containment lattice and interception field alike. Heaven's mapping updated mid-process to account for an unregistered stabilizing factor, while Hell's counterclaim flagged the same event as resource denial. And as both sides recalculated ownership of a variable neither could control, the township's power grid failed entirely under the strain. The township's blackout didn't remain local for long, because the engagement zone had already begun interacting with infrastructure that wasn't designed to coexist with overlapping containment lattices and breach fields. Substations across the county tripped in sequence as automated fail-safes interpreted the interference as cascading overload, and when backup grids attempted to compensate, they encountered the same spatial inconsistencies that had destabilized drone telemetry minutes earlier. Civilian panic shifted from curiosity to evacuation, as emergency services failed to route calls through networks that no longer aligned with mapped geography. Sam watched the salvage yard's generator sputter and die, not because it lacked fuel, but because the space it occupied no longer registered as electrically stable, and realized that whatever this had been about initially, it was now rewriting the rules governing physical systems within the zone. Dean had moved the Impala toward what used to be the driveway exit, only to find that the road beyond had shifted half a meter sideways relative to the fence line, creating an offset that shouldn't have been possible without excavation. Bobby swore because landmarks hunters relied on were no longer consistent. Above them, heaven's lattice thickened in response to hell's continued breach attempts, layering containment protocols that normally restricted archangel-level entities within fixed spatial limits. Castiel relayed that the directive had escalated to divine threshold, meaning authorization for removal if classification remained inconclusive. Saitama listened to none of it, because he was still examining the suppression platform's warped barrel as though trying to determine whether it could be repaired. Hell interpreted the lattice reinforcement as an attempt to deny access permanently, prompting a second wave of manifestations that forced matter into cohesion with less concern for stability. One of them coalesced fully enough to strike, claws meeting Saitama's back with a sound that resembled metal on concrete, and achieved nothing beyond momentary resistance. He turned with mild curiosity and tapped the shape aside. The tap carried enough force to ripple outward through the engagement zone, collapsing another fracture and sending a pressure wave into the containment lattice that forced heaven to recalibrate mid-process. Military observers registered the disturbance as a seismic event, prompting emergency alerts that spread beyond state lines within minutes. Market closures began triggering automatically in response to infrastructure uncertainty. Dean realized that public perception had already shifted from anomaly to existential risk, because live commentary was now framing the blackout as evidence of hostile incursion rather than isolated incident. Sam attempted to contact agencies he knew wouldn't answer, while Bobby began packing supplies for a relocation that might not have coordinates anymore. Castiel hesitated before stating that Heaven was considering isolation at a level that would remove the entire zone from conventional space. Saitama finally looked up from the damaged equipment and asked whether the helicopters were going to keep flying in circles, because the noise was becoming repetitive. His movement carried him toward the perimeter where the lattice intersected with Hell's breach field, prompting both sides to adjust containment vectors simultaneously. The interaction produced a distortion that bent light around his silhouette. And as Heaven authorized the first removal protocol, the engagement zone's boundaries began to detach from mapped reality. The detachment didn't resemble movement so much as disconnection, because the moment Heaven authorized removal protocols at divine threshold, the engagement zone stopped aligning with the surrounding county in ways that no satellite could track in real time. Roads that had once led toward Bobby's salvage yard now looped back into empty fields, while GPS systems began returning coordinates that overlapped with infrastructure miles away. Civilian evacuation attempts stalled as vehicles encountered intersections that no longer intersected, and emergency broadcasts devolved into contradictory instructions as mapping data failed to reconcile shifting boundaries. Sam felt the change first when the Impala's radio cut out mid-sentence and resumed on a different frequency broadcasting, whether from another state, prompting Dean to shut it off before it cycled again. Bobby had already packed what he could carry, but relocation required a destination that existed, and the township's grid failure had spread into neighboring counties as substations struggled to route power into a space that didn't maintain consistent dimensions. Castiel confirmed that Heaven's lattice had transitioned from containment to isolation, attempting to excise the zone from conventional spacetime without collapsing its contents. Hell's interception units reacted by forcing additional breaches along the perimeter, not to escape, but to maintain access to a resource now being removed from shared reality. Their manifestations grew less stable as spatial anchors failed, coalescing into forms that flickered between cohesion states as they lunged toward Saitama with diminishing effectiveness. One managed to make contact with his arm, and was dismissed with a casual motion that sent a shockwave outward into both lattice and breach field alike. Military liaison teams monitoring from beyond the shifting boundary registered the disturbance as a localized gravity fluctuation, prompting emergency advisories that reached federal command within minutes. Markets that had remained open through the blackout triggered full suspension as automated systems interpreted the anomaly as an existential infrastructure threat. News networks reframed the incident as an ongoing isolation event affecting regional stability. Dean watched the salvage yard's fence line bend inward without breaking, as though space itself had decided to accommodate a smaller perimeter, and realized that evacuation might no longer be an option regardless of direction. Sam attempted to mark their position using landmarks that refused to remain fixed, while Bobby muttered that hunters didn't train for disappearing counties. Castile stated that Heaven's next step would involve complete severance if classification remained unresolved. Saitama stepped toward the lattice's inner edge out of curiosity, tapping the air where light distortion suggested a boundary and asking whether it was supposed to feel like that. The contact produced a ripple that traveled upward through the containment structure, forcing angelic units to recalibrate isolation vectors mid-process. Hell's breaches responded by widening in kind. Civilian panic escalated beyond the zone as evacuation routes collapsed under misinformation, prompting political authorities to issue travel bans that markets interpreted as regional shutdowns. Supply chains began rerouting around areas that might no longer exist by morning. Sam noted that this had stopped being about demons hours ago. Above them, Heaven prepared the final severance protocol, and below, Hell anchored its last claim. The final severance protocol did not announce itself with light or thunder, because the process required precision rather than spectacle, and Heaven had no interest in destabilizing what it intended to remove intact. From outside the engagement zone, satellite feeds began returning empty terrain where an entire township had stood minutes earlier, replaced by atmospheric distortion that interfered with optical sensors without registering as cloud cover. Federal command interpreted the anomaly as data loss, until secondary imaging confirmed the absence persisted across wavelengths. Inside the zone, the change manifested as silence, not because the helicopters had withdrawn, but because sound itself began to dampen as spatial consistency failed to propagate vibration correctly. Sam noticed it when Bobby's generator coughed without producing noise, while Dean's boot struck gravel that didn't echo the way it should have. Castile confirmed that the lattice had transitioned into full severance mode, isolating the contained volume from conventional spacetime in preparation for removal. Hell's interception units reacted immediately, forcing their remaining manifestations into cohesion that bordered on collapse, because once severed, access would be impossible regardless of claim. One of them struck Saitama from behind with enough force to fracture the concrete beneath his feet, achieving nothing beyond momentary displacement. He turned, mildly irritated this time, and brushed the shape aside. The resulting impact didn't disperse the manifestation so much as erase the breach it had used to enter, collapsing the fracture into smooth continuity that Heaven's mapping registered as spontaneous stabilization. Angelic units recalibrated again, because the removal protocol relied on maintaining structural integrity during extraction, and Saitama's casual motion had just reinforced a boundary they'd been struggling to hold. Military observers, beyond the distortion, recorded the event as a gravitational spike. Dean realized that whatever Heaven intended to do would take them with it unless classification resolved in the next few seconds, prompting Sam to ask whether relocation was even meaningful once severance completed. Bobby packed the last of his supplies without answering, because hunters didn't plan for being excised from reality. Castile hesitated before stating that Heaven considered collateral acceptable at this threshold. Saitama looked around at the bending fence line and asked whether the store would still be open after all this, stepping toward the inner edge where light distortion had thickened into something almost visible. His contact with the boundary produced another ripple that traveled through the lattice, forcing Heaven to delay extraction by a fraction of a second. Hell's final breach anchored below. And as Severance reached 90% completion, the engagement zone began to lift. From the outside, there was no visible ascent, because once Severance passed the 90% threshold, the engagement zone no longer occupied altitude in any conventional sense. Satellite feeds returned a stabilized absence where the township had been, forcing Federal Command to classify the incident as a spatial loss event rather than infrastructure failure. Emergency briefings reframed evacuation advisories into exclusion zones, while markets that had suspended trading began pricing in the permanent disappearance of mapped territory. Inside, the lift manifested as compression rather than motion, with fence lines drawing inward toward coordinates that refused to hold, and roadways bending into arcs that terminated in open ground. Sam felt the shift as pressure behind his eyes, prompting Dean to grab the Impala's doorframe to maintain orientation in a space that no longer aligned with gravity in a consistent direction. Bobby muttered that hunters didn't train for being relocated without travel. Castile confirmed that Heaven's extraction was entering its final phase, isolating the contained volume for removal into a controlled pocket where classification could proceed without interference from Hell. Angelic units reinforced the lattice to maintain integrity during transfer, while Hell's final breach flared below in a last attempt to retain access to a resource now being denied. Their manifestations forced cohesion one final time. One of them lunged at Saitama with enough mass to fracture the ground beneath his feet, achieving nothing beyond contact. He turned, mildly annoyed now, and tapped it aside with the same casual motion that had collapsed previous fractures. The impact didn't just disperse the manifestation, it destabilized the anchored breach entirely, sending a shockwave upward through the lattice that Heaven's mapping registered as structural compromise. Extraction protocols required stable boundaries, and Saitama's interference had just introduced variability into a process that could not tolerate deviation. Angelic units recalibrated mid-transfer, delaying removal by seconds that Hell used to force a secondary breach along the perimeter. Military observers beyond the absence recorded a momentary return of terrain before it vanished again. Dean realized that Heaven's solution involved removing everything present regardless of classification, prompting Sam to shout that collateral included them. Bobby reached for the Impala's keys out of reflex, even though relocation had no direction left to follow. Castile stated that severance could not be reversed once completed. Saitama stepped toward the thickened boundary out of curiosity, pressing a finger against the distortion as though testing glass, and asked whether this was going to take much longer. The contact produced a ripple that traveled through both lattice and breach alike, forcing Heaven to choose between immediate extraction or total collapse. He tapped it once more. The containment structure failed not explosively but completely, dissolving into alignment with a space that no longer recognized the township's removal as valid. Hell's breach collapsed in tandem, severing access from below without reclaiming claim, while the engagement zone settled back into mapped reality with permanent offset. Satellite feeds updated to show the township had returned, but 3 miles west of its original coordinates, intersecting with infrastructure that had never planned for overlap. Roads terminated inside buildings, power lines ran through empty fields, and property boundaries no longer matched ownership records. Castile confirmed that Heaven's records now listed the anomaly as unclassifiable and beyond containment. Hell registered resource denial as permanent loss. Saitama asked if the grocery store was still open. The world did not move back.